Forget everything you thought you knew about ancient navigation. Did you know that some of the greatest voyages in human history were made by people who couldn't even read a map? It's true. Ancient navigators, with nothing more than their profound understanding of the natural world, mastered journeys across thousands of miles of open ocean. Forget everything you thought you knew about early exploration as we delve into the sophisticated techniques that allowed them to navigate by star compasses, wave patterns, and even the flight of birds. I'm making a bold claim. The greatest navigators in human history weren't European explorers with their compasses and sextants, but ancient peoples who sailed the Pacific using only their senses. We're about to uncover secrets so profound, you'll question how humanity lost this incredible knowledge. Get ready to have your mind blown as we reveal the true genius behind their seemingly impossible journeys. I'm going to prove that pre-modern mariners, thousands of years ago, possessed a scientific understanding of the oceans more advanced than many societies centuries later. How did they cross vast, uncharted waters with nothing but the stars and waves? The answer will fundamentally reshape your view of human ingenuity and exploration. Ancient Polynesians, without maps, compasses, or GPS, achieved feats of oceanic travel that modern sailors, even with all their technology, would struggle to replicate. Their methods were not just clever. They were a complete system of celestial and environmental observation that defies contemporary understanding. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint for conquering the impossible. For most of modern history, we've told ourselves a comforting story, a story where progress moves in a straight line, where knowledge accumulates, where technology only ever improves. According to this story, ancient sailors were brave, but crude, lucky, but ignorant. Their voyages, we're told, were accidental drifts, guided by superstition rather than science. That story is wrong, and today we're tearing it apart. The greatest navigators you've never been taught about prepare for a revelation. Ancient Polynesians, without maps, compasses, sextants, or GPS, achieved feats of oceanic travel that many modern sailors, even with advanced technology, would struggle to replicate. Their methods were not clever tricks or folklore. They were a complete systematic framework of celestial, oceanographic, and ecological knowledge. So this isn't just history, it's a blueprint for conquering the impossible. Across the Pacific, Earth's largest and most unforgiving ocean, human beings deliberately settled thousands of islands, separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles of open water. Hawaii, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, Tahiti, Samoa. These weren't accidents. They were intentional voyages, and Polynesians weren't alone. From the Vikings navigating the North Atlantic, to Micronesian navigators reading invisible wave patterns, to Indian Ocean traders harnessing monsoon winds centuries before Europeans understood them. Ancient mariners mastered systems of navigation that modern science is only now fully appreciating. The bold claim that changes everything. I'm making a bold claim. The greatest navigators in human history weren't European explorers armed with compasses and charts, but ancient peoples who sailed using only their senses, memory, and deep environmental literacy. Even more unsettling? Much of this knowledge wasn't lost because it was inferior. It was lost because it was never written down, and later dismissed by colonial powers who failed to understand it. We're about to uncover secrets so profound, you'll start wondering how humanity forgot something so powerful. Why the ocean was never empty. Imagine crossing vast oceans thousands of years ago. No GPS, no compass, no written charts, just the stars and the waves. Sounds impossible, right? Yet ancient mariners, from Polynesians to Vikings, did this routinely, not once, not twice, but generation after generation, with astonishing accuracy. The mistake modern thinking makes is assuming the ocean is empty. To ancient navigators, it wasn't. It was alive with information. Wave directions told stories. Bird flight paths whispered secrets. Cloud formations hinted at distant land. Stars didn't just shine. They formed a living compass. The ocean wasn't chaos. It was a readable system. The star compass, a sky you could sail. One of the most misunderstood tools of ancient navigation is the so-called star compass, used extensively by Polynesian navigators. This wasn't a physical object. It was a mental map of the horizon, memorized in extraordinary detail. Navigators knew exactly where key stars rose and set throughout the year. Each star marked a direction. As the canoe moved, the stars walked across the sky, allowing sailors to hold precise headings for days or even weeks. No instruments, no numbers, just embodied knowledge passed orally, from master navigator to apprentice. Modern experiments, such as those conducted using reconstructed Polynesian voyaging canoes, have repeatedly proven that these methods work with terrifying accuracy. Not approximately, precisely. The canoes that crossed continents. Let's address another myth. Ancient vessels were not flimsy rafts. Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoes were engineering masterpieces, flexible, fast, and remarkably stable in open ocean conditions. Some stretched over 90 feet long and could carry dozens of people, plants, animals, and supplies for months at sea. These weren't desperate survival journeys. They were planned colonization expeditions, and that alone should force us to rethink everything we assume about ancient maritime capability. When primitive knowledge outperformed modern tech. Here's a surprising fact. Some of the greatest voyages in human history were made by people who couldn't read a map. That's not a weakness. It's the point. Ancient navigators didn't rely on abstract symbols. They relied on direct sensory feedback from the environment, processed through disciplined training and memory. Modern sailors who depend entirely on GPS often struggle when systems fail. Traditional navigators didn't have that problem. Their knowledge lived inside them. A story. Written in waves and stars. Picture this. You're adrift in the endless Pacific. The nearest land is thousands of miles away in every direction. How do you find your way home? For ancient Polynesian mariners, this wasn't a nightmare. It was a challenge they met with calm confidence. By reading the subtle language of swell patterns, by tracking the nightly arc of stars, by noticing the behavior of birds at dawn and dusk, they transformed impossible journeys into breathtaking triumphs of human ingenuity. And we're only just beginning this story. To most modern observers, the open ocean appears chaotic. Endless water stretches in every direction. Waves collide seemingly at random. And without instruments, the sea feels like a featureless void. This perception has shaped a powerful assumption in modern thinking, that ancient mariners were navigating blindly, relying on luck rather than knowledge. But this assumption collapses the moment we understand how deeply ancient navigators studied the movement of the ocean itself. For them, the sea was not empty. It was structured, layered, and filled with information constantly in motion. The first thing ancient mariners understood, long before modern oceanography gave it scientific language, was that not all waves are the same. The choppy surface waves people notice first are created by local winds, but beneath them travel deep, long-period swells generated by storms, sometimes thousands of miles away. These swells can persist for weeks, even months, moving across entire ocean basins with remarkable directional stability. While winds shift and clouds scatter, primary swells continue on their paths, like slow, invisible rivers. To ancient navigators, these swells were reliable reference points, far more dependable than the weather above them. Instead of watching the sea, skilled navigators felt it. Inside a canoe, they learned to sense how the hull rose, dipped, rolled, and twisted under the influence of multiple swells arriving from different directions. Each swell had its own signature rhythm, its own timing, angle, and pressure. By learning these patterns through years of training, navigators could distinguish the dominant swell from secondary and tertiary ones. Even in complete darkness, even under heavy cloud cover when stars disappeared, the ocean continued to communicate direction through motion. The body itself became an instrument, registering information more subtly than any mechanical device. This sensory approach was not mystical or vague. It was empirical. Modern science now confirms that swell systems maintain directional consistency over immense distances. When these swells encounter land, they are disrupted. They bend, reflect, split, and interfere with one another, creating complex but recognizable patterns that extend far beyond the visible horizon. In practical terms, this means that islands announce their presence through wave behavior long before they can be seen. To an untrained sailor, the ocean still looks random. To a trained navigator, it changes character in detectable ways, signaling proximity to land. Nowhere was this understanding more refined than among navigators of Micronesia, who developed an extraordinary way of conceptualizing wave behavior. They created what are often called stick charts, frameworks of thin wooden strips tied together with shells. These objects were never meant to be carried aboard a canoe. Instead, they served as learning tools, teaching apprentices how swells moved across the ocean and interacted with islands. Curved sticks represented the paths of major swells. Intersections marked areas where waves collided or bent, and shells indicated islands. The charts were not maps of distance or scale. They were diagrams of relationships. Once memorized, the navigator no longer needed the physical object. The ocean itself became the chart. This detail is crucial because it reveals something often misunderstood about ancient navigation. Knowledge was not stored externally. It lived in memory. Navigators trained for years, sometimes decades, absorbing an immense body of environmental information passed down orally through stories, chants, and demonstrations. Memory was not a weakness of the system. It was the system. Songs encoded sequences of islands. Rhythms mirrored wave timing. Stories anchored spatial relationships in narrative form. In this way, navigation knowledge became resilient, adaptable, and deeply integrated into human experience. European explorers arriving in the Pacific struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Islanders traveled between tiny landmasses, separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles, and they did so repeatedly, season after season. These voyages were not one-way accidents. They involved return trips, trade, settlement, and the transport of crops, animals, and entire families. Drift voyages could not explain this level of precision. Luck could not account for consistency. Yet many Europeans dismissed the achievements as coincidence because they did not recognize the underlying system at work. One of the most striking aspects of wave-based navigation is a phenomenon modern researchers only recently began to study seriously. Navigators described subtle wave corridors formed by the interaction of swells between islands. These patterns created faint but continuous directional cues across long distances, allowing sailors to maintain course even when other references were unavailable. For generations, such descriptions were labeled as folklore. But when scientists finally measured wave behavior in these regions, they found that the patterns were real. The ocean itself was forming pathways, dynamic, shifting, yet stable enough to be followed by those trained to detect them. And this realization forces an uncomfortable question. If ancient navigators possessed such refined observational systems, why did this knowledge nearly disappear? The answer is not that it failed. It is that it was displaced. Colonial expansion introduced compasses, charts, and later engines, technologies that reduced the need for embodied environmental knowledge. Traditional training systems were disrupted, sometimes actively suppressed. Oral knowledge, lacking written documentation, was dismissed as unscientific. Within a few generations, lineages of expertise stretching back centuries were fractured. Yet when modern navigators attempt to relearn these methods, they encounter a humbling truth. Without electronic aids, many struggle. Traditional systems demand patience, discipline, and deep environmental awareness. They are harder to learn, but astonishingly robust once mastered. Recent revival voyages using traditional techniques alone have repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness. Canoes have crossed vast stretches of open ocean, navigating accurately without modern instruments, guided only by stars, swells, winds, and living memory. This is why wave navigation matters so much to the larger story of human exploration. It reveals that ancient mariners were not merely reacting to nature. They were interpreting it with scientific precision. They developed models of ocean behavior grounded in observation, tested through experience, and refined across generations. The ocean was not a barrier to be survived. It was a system to be read, and waves were only one layer of that system. Above the water, the sky offered another set of signals, equally precise and even more ancient. In the next part of this journey, the focus will shift upward, from the movement of the sea to the movement of the stars, where ancient navigators built celestial frameworks so accurate that they functioned as living maps of the heavens. When the surface of the ocean fell silent and the waves alone were not enough, ancient mariners lifted their eyes to the sky. What they saw was not a scattering of distant lights, but a vast orderly system in motion. To modern observers, stars appear decorative or poetic. To ancient navigators, they were instruments, precise, reliable, and alive with directional meaning. Long before telescopes, charts, or mathematical astronomy, humans built navigation systems based entirely on the predictable choreography of the heavens. But the most important realization ancient mariners made was deceptively simple. Stars rise and set in consistent locations along the horizon. Night after night, year after year, the same stars emerged from the sea at nearly identical points, climbed predictable paths across the sky, and disappeared at fixed locations on the opposite horizon. These rising and setting points formed a natural compass, far older than metal needles or magnetic fields. Direction did not need to be discovered. It only needed to be remembered. Polynesian navigators organized this knowledge into what is often called a star compass, though it was not a physical object. It existed entirely in the mind. The horizon was divided into directional houses, each associated with the rising or setting of specific stars. When a navigator set out on a voyage, they selected a sequence of stars to follow, holding the canoe's heading by keeping a chosen star aligned with a fixed point on the vessel. As that star climbed higher into the sky and eventually set, another star would rise in the same directional house, seamlessly taking its place. In this way, a heading could be maintained for hours without interruption. This system required extraordinary memory. Navigators memorized dozens, sometimes hundreds of stars, along with their seasonal movements. They knew which stars were visible at different times of year, and which ones disappeared below the horizon entirely. They understood that the night sky itself changes over long voyages, especially when traveling north or south, and they adjusted their expectations accordingly. Rather than relying on a single reference, they used a constantly updating web of celestial cues. Importantly, this was not theoretical knowledge. It was learned through practice. Apprentices spent years sailing short routes, learning how the sky looked from different latitudes, how stars tilted and shifted as the canoe moved across the ocean. The sky was not static. It responded to motion, and navigators learned to read those changes as clearly as others might read numbers on a dial. Latitude, one of the most important concepts in modern navigation, was also understood without formal measurement. Ancient mariners noticed that certain stars passed directly overhead only in specific regions. As they traveled north or south, familiar stars would climb higher or lower in the sky or disappear altogether. By tracking these changes, navigators knew when they had reached the latitude of their destination. They might not have used degrees, but the outcome was the same. Position was inferred through observation, not calculation. Even clouds played a role. Low islands often announced themselves through reflections on the underside of clouds, creating faint, bright patches long before land could be seen. Navigators learned to distinguish these land clouds from ordinary weather formations. Combined with stellar cues, this allowed them to fine-tune their approach, correcting course as they closed in on their target. The night sky also served as a clock. Stars rise at slightly different times throughout the year, shifting roughly 4 minutes earlier each night. While this change is subtle, skilled observers could track it, allowing them to estimate seasons and even time of night. This mattered because many voyages were timed to coincide with seasonal wind patterns and ocean conditions. Celestial observation was not just about direction, it was about timing. In northern waters, different cultures developed parallel systems. Viking sailors navigating the North Atlantic relied on solar position, daylight length, and the behavior of the sky at high latitudes, where stars behave differently. During long summer days, when stars were barely visible, they tracked the sun's arc and its height above the horizon. Some evidence suggests they used simple optical aids, such as sunstones, to locate the sun even through cloud cover. While the environment was different, the underlying principle was the same. Nature itself provided reliable navigational data for those trained to interpret it. What unites all these systems is a way of thinking fundamentally different from modern navigation. Ancient mariners did not separate navigation from environment. They did not extract data and then process it abstractly. They immersed themselves within the system they were navigating. The sky, sea, wind, and wildlife were not external variables. They were partners in a continuous conversation. This integration made the system resilient. If stars were obscured by clouds, waves still spoke. If swells became confused, birds and wind offered clues. Navigation was never dependent on a single point of failure. It was distributed across the environment and the navigator's senses. In contrast, modern navigation often concentrates trust in a single device. When that device fails, the system collapses. Perhaps the most striking aspect of celestial navigation is how little margin for error it allowed, and how successfully ancient mariners operated within those limits. Missing a small island by even a few degrees could mean sailing past it entirely. Yet historical and archaeological evidence shows repeated accurate landfalls across enormous distances. This level of success is incompatible with chance. It points to mastery. Over time, as written maps and instruments spread, these embodied systems were gradually abandoned. Knowledge that could not be easily recorded was undervalued. Songs were forgotten. Training lineages faded. What survived were fragments, enough to hint at a lost sophistication, but not always enough to fully reconstruct it without effort. Today, that effort is underway. Navigators relearning traditional celestial techniques often describe a profound shift in perception. The sky stops being scenery and becomes structure. Stars become directional anchors. The ocean feels less vast, less hostile. Space itself becomes legible. Understanding ancient celestial navigation does more than correct historical misconceptions. It challenges modern assumptions about intelligence, science, and progress. It reminds us that knowledge does not only live in books or machines. It can live in people, carried across generations, written not on paper, but in the sky. And above that sky, one more layer still influenced ancient voyages: the winds themselves. In the next part of this story, we'll follow those invisible currents that powered global trade routes and migrations long before engines or sails were standardized, revealing how ancient mariners learned to ride the breath of the planet itself. Long before engines turned propellers and before sails were standardized into rigid designs, ancient mariners learned to work with something far more powerful and far more predictable than any machine: the wind. To the untrained observer, wind feels erratic, something that comes and goes without pattern. But to ancient sailors, wind was seasonal, directional, and dependable. It followed rhythms tied to the heating of land and sea, to the tilt of the earth, and to the slow breathing of the planet itself. Those who understood these rhythms could move across oceans with astonishing efficiency. Perhaps the most important wind system ever mastered by ancient seafarers was the monsoon. Across the Indian Ocean, winds reverse direction almost like clockwork. For part of the year, they blow steadily from the southwest, carrying ships from Africa and Arabia toward India and Southeast Asia. Months later, they reverse, flowing from the northeast and enabling the return journey. This was not a subtle effect. These winds were strong, reliable, and persistent, shaping human movement on a continental scale. Ancient sailors did not merely notice the monsoon. They built entire economic and cultural systems around it. Voyages were planned months in advance, timed precisely to depart when the winds shifted. Ports flourished, not because of chance geography, but because they sat at the crossroads of these atmospheric highways. Goods, people, languages, religions, and ideas traveled with the wind, creating one of the earliest truly interconnected worlds. What makes this remarkable is that these systems were understood without meteorology as we know it today. There were no pressure maps, no satellite images, no mathematical climate models. Instead, knowledge was accumulated through observation across generations. Sailors noticed that certain winds arrived at the same time each year, that clouds formed in recognizable ways before seasonal shifts, that the smell of rain and the behavior of animals changed as the monsoon approached. This knowledge was passed down orally, refined through experience, and treated with deep respect. To ignore the wind's patterns was not merely unwise, it was dangerous. In the Pacific, different but equally powerful wind systems shaped navigation. The trade winds blow steadily from east to west near the equator, while westerlies dominate higher latitudes. Polynesian navigators understood how to enter, exit, and cross these wind belts. They did not fight the wind. They anticipated it. Voyages were planned to take advantage of prevailing conditions, sometimes following curved routes that appear inefficient on a modern map, but made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of wind and swell interaction. Sail technology evolved alongside this understanding. Early sails were not rigid triangles designed for speed alone. They were flexible, adjustable, and responsive to subtle changes in wind direction. The lateen sail, for example, allowed sailors to tack against the wind far more effectively than square sails, opening new possibilities for maneuvering and return voyages. And these innovations did not emerge in isolation. They were responses to environmental knowledge already in place. Wind was never considered in isolation from other signals. Ancient mariners read it alongside waves, stars, clouds, and even smell. A shift in wind direction altered swell patterns. Changes in wind strength affected bird behavior and cloud formation. Navigation was holistic. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system with built-in redundancy. If one signal became unreliable, others filled the gap. This integrated approach explains why ancient navigation systems were so resilient. Modern navigation often relies on precise but fragile tools. A broken engine, a failed GPS signal, or a damaged instrument can leave a vessel helpless. Traditional systems, by contrast, distributed knowledge across the environment and the navigator's senses. There was no single point of failure. The wind did not disappear, simply because clouds rolled in or stars were hidden. It remained readable through its effects on the sea and sky. The mastery of wind also challenges the idea that ancient mariners hugged coastlines out of fear. In many regions, coastal sailing was actually more dangerous due to unpredictable gusts, shifting currents, and hidden hazards. Open ocean routes, aligned with stable wind systems, could be safer and faster. This is why ancient trade routes often cut directly across seas rather than tracing their edges. These were not reckless decisions. They were informed choices. As with wave and star navigation, much of this wind knowledge faded, not because it stopped working, but because it was replaced. Steam engines freed ships from seasonal constraints. Modern forecasting reduced the need for generational memory. Written logs and charts displaced oral tradition. In the process, something subtle was lost, an intimate relationship with atmospheric patterns that had once shaped human movement at a planetary scale. Yet when modern sailors attempt long-distance voyages without engines, they often rediscover the same truths ancient mariners lived by. Wind is not an obstacle, it is a guide. Those who learn its language gain access to routes that feel almost effortless, as if the ocean itself is cooperating. Those who ignore it are forced into constant struggle. Understanding ancient wind navigation also reframes human history. It explains how ideas spread so widely so early. It clarifies why distant cultures share crops, technologies, and myths. It shows that oceans were not barriers separating civilizations, but connective tissues binding them together. Wind turned water into pathways. When combined with wave reading and celestial navigation, wind knowledge completed a triad that made global exploration possible long before modern instruments existed. The sea provided motion, the sky provided direction, and the wind provided power. Together, they formed a navigation system elegant in its simplicity and profound in its effectiveness. But even this was not the full picture. There was one more set of navigational allies ancient mariners relied upon, living ones. Birds, fish, and marine mammals all carried information about land and sea conditions, and skilled navigators learned to read their behavior with astonishing precision. In the next part of this story, we'll follow those living signals and uncover how nature itself became a moving map across the oceans. For ancient mariners, the ocean was not an empty stage occupied only by wind and waves. It was alive. Birds crossed the sky with purpose, fish gathered and scattered in meaningful ways, and even marine mammals followed routes shaped by underwater geography. To a trained navigator, these living beings were not background noise. They were messengers, carrying information about land, currents, and distance in ways no inanimate tool ever could. One of the most important clues came from birds. Many seabirds can travel hundreds of miles from land during the day, but they cannot sleep on the water. As evening approaches, they must return to shore. Ancient navigators knew this. They memorized which species flew farthest, which stayed closest to land, and which directions different birds tended to take at specific times of day. At dawn, birds flying out to sea suggested land lay behind them. At dusk, birds flying low and steadily in one direction often meant land lay ahead. This was not guesswork. It was tested repeatedly through experience. Navigators learned to distinguish between birds that roosted on land and those that could remain at sea for long periods. A single bird sighting meant little, but patterns mattered. Multiple birds flying with intent, at consistent height and direction, formed a reliable signal. In the open Pacific, where islands could be separated by hundreds of miles, such signals were invaluable. Among the most respected avian guides was the frigate bird. It can travel immense distances and has exceptional vision, but it cannot land on water. This made its behavior especially informative. If a navigator spotted a frigate bird late in the day, it almost certainly meant land was within reach. Stories passed down among navigators often described releasing a captured bird and watching its flight path to confirm direction. While such stories are sometimes dismissed as legend, experimental voyages have shown the logic behind them. The bird does not know maps, but it knows survival, and its choices reflect real geography. Birds also interacted with other navigational cues. They often followed schools of fish, which themselves gathered where currents converged or where underwater features pushed nutrients toward the surface. By watching birds dive repeatedly in one area, navigators could infer not only the presence of fish, but also the structure of the water below. These feeding zones were frequently associated with currents and island shelves, providing indirect information about location. Fish behavior offered clues as well. Certain species prefer specific water temperatures, salinity levels, or current strengths. As a canoe moved across the ocean, changes in fish sightings hinted at shifts in water mass. Experienced navigators recognized these transitions. They knew when they were entering different ecological zones and adjusted expectations accordingly. The ocean, in this sense, was not uniform. It was divided into regions, each with its own living signatures. Marine mammals added another layer. Dolphins, for example, often follow consistent routes along currents and island chains, and their sudden appearance or disappearance could indicate changes in depth or proximity to land. Whales migrate along predictable paths tied to seasons and feeding grounds. While ancient mariners did not track these migrations with charts, they observed them closely. Repeated encounters formed mental maps of movement across vast spaces. Even smaller signs mattered. Floating debris, drifting vegetation, and certain types of seaweed tended to accumulate near land or along specific current lines. A single leaf might mean nothing, but increasing frequency of such material told a story. The smell of land, earthy, vegetal, distinct from salt and water, was another subtle cue. Navigators spoke of sensing islands before seeing them, and modern sailors who spend long periods at sea often report the same phenomenon. What made all of this effective was not any single signal, but synthesis. Ancient navigation was never about relying on one indicator alone. Birds confirmed what waves suggested. Fish behavior aligned with current patterns. Wind shifts matched cloud formations. Each piece reinforced the others, building confidence through convergence. When multiple signals agreed, navigators acted decisively. When they conflicted, caution prevailed. This approach required patience and humility. Navigators did not impose their will on the environment. They listened. They adjusted. They understood that the ocean was dynamic, that conditions changed, and that certainty emerged gradually, rather than instantly. In this way, navigation became a dialogue rather than a calculation. The reliance on living indicators also reveals something profound about ancient knowledge systems. They were ecological. Navigators understood themselves as part of a web of life, not separate from it. Survival depended on attention, respect, and long-term observation. Knowledge was not abstracted away from experience. It was inseparable from it. As with other aspects of traditional navigation, this ecological literacy suffered under modernization. Engines reduced dependence on currents and animals. Instruments replaced observation. Over time, fewer sailors needed to watch birds or notice subtle changes in watercolor. The skills faded, not because they stopped being useful, but because they were no longer required by dominant technologies. Yet when modern expeditions attempt long, engine-free voyages, these skills resurface. Sailors quickly realize that electronics cannot replace every form of awareness. Batteries die, screens fail, but birds still fly, fish still gather, dolphins still follow currents. Nature continues to broadcast information, waiting to be noticed. Understanding how ancient mariners used living signals reshapes our perception of intelligence itself. It challenges the idea that knowledge must be written, measured, or mechanized to be scientific. It shows that careful observation, repeated testing, and intergenerational transmission can produce systems as reliable as any modern instrument. By reading birds, fish, and marine mammals, ancient navigators transformed the ocean into a living map. Land was not just a destination. It was something that announced itself through the behavior of life across sea and sky. This made the ocean less hostile, less unknown, and more navigable than modern assumptions allow. And still, one crucial question remains. How did such complex systems survive for centuries without written records, universities, or formal institutions? The answer lies not in tools or techniques, but in culture itself. In the next part of this story, we'll explore how navigation knowledge was preserved, protected, and transmitted across generations through ritual, story, and social structure, turning memory into one of humanity's most powerful technologies. If ancient navigation relied so heavily on memory, observation, and embodied skill, then its survival depended on something even more powerful than technique: culture. These systems endured not because they were written down, but because they were woven into everyday life, ritual, and identity. Navigation knowledge was not treated as a hobby or a profession in the modern sense. It was sacred responsibility, social capital, and survival strategy all at once. To lose it was to risk losing the ability to exist. Training a navigator did not begin with stars or waves. It began with listening. Young apprentices spent years absorbing stories, chants, and genealogies that, on the surface, seemed unrelated to sailing. But these narratives encoded sequences of islands, prevailing winds, seasonal cues, and moral lessons about patience and restraint. A story about an ancestor's voyage might double as a mnemonic device, embedding directional knowledge inside myth. In this way, Memory was strengthened through meaning. Facts were never isolated. They were attached to emotion, identity, and community. And this method of transmission solved a problem modern education often struggles with: retention. Knowledge tied to story and ritual is harder to forget. When navigational information was sung, danced, or recited during ceremonies, it was rehearsed constantly. Every repetition reinforced accuracy. Errors were corrected publicly. Elders acted as living archives, ensuring continuity across generations. The ocean was vast, but the chain of memory connecting navigators to their predecessors was unbroken. Secrecy also played a role. In many cultures, advanced navigational knowledge was restricted to select individuals. This was not elitism for its own sake. It was quality control. Teaching required immense investment of time and trust, and misuse of the knowledge could be deadly. By limiting access, societies ensured that those who carried the responsibility were deeply committed and rigorously trained. Knowledge was protected not by locks or laws, but by social structure. Ritual reinforced this seriousness. Before major voyages, ceremonies honored ancestors, acknowledged environmental forces, and reminded crews of their dependence on cooperation and respect. These rituals were not superstition in opposition to science. They were psychological preparation. They aligned attention, discipline, and humility, qualities essential for interpreting subtle environmental cues. A distracted navigator was a dangerous one. Ritual helped focus the mind. Failure, when it occurred, was studied. Voyages that went wrong became lessons, folded back into oral tradition. Mistakes were remembered precisely because they were costly. Over time, and this created a feedback loop similar to scientific peer review. Claims were tested by experience. Successful methods persisted. Ineffective ones disappeared. The ocean itself acted as the ultimate arbiter. This cultural framework explains how navigation systems could remain stable for centuries while still adapting to change. Climate patterns shift. Storm frequencies vary. New islands are discovered. Rather than freezing knowledge in static form, oral systems allowed for continuous updating. New experiences were integrated into existing narratives. The map was never finished. It evolved with the people who used it. When colonial systems disrupted these cultures, the damage went far beyond the loss of boats or tools. It fractured the social mechanisms that sustained knowledge. Children were removed from elders. Rituals were suppressed. Oral languages declined. Navigation skills, once central to identity, were suddenly devalued. Without constant rehearsal and respect, even the most robust memory systems can erode quickly. Yet fragments survived. Songs remembered without full context. Stories passed down without their original meaning. In some cases, elders quietly preserved knowledge, waiting for a time when it could be used again. That time came unexpectedly in the 20th century, when scholars and indigenous communities began collaborating to revive traditional voyaging. What followed was remarkable. Using reconstructed canoes and revived training methods, navigators set out to test whether the old systems still worked. They did. Voyages succeeded across thousands of miles. Landfalls were accurate. Routes made sense. These were not symbolic gestures, Arn. They were practical demonstrations that the knowledge had never been obsolete, only interrupted. Participants in these revival efforts often described a profound transformation. Learning traditional navigation changed how they perceived the world. The ocean stopped being empty space and became textured. The sky stopped being decoration and became structure. Memory expanded. Attention sharpened. Navigation was no longer about controlling movement, but about participating in a larger system. This realization carries uncomfortable implications for modern society. It suggests that progress is not always additive. Some forms of knowledge are lost, not because they fail, but because they are incompatible with dominant systems of power and documentation. It also suggests that intelligence is broader than we often admit. A navigator who can feel direction through waves and stars is not less scientific than one who reads instruments. They are applying science through a different medium. The cultural transmission of navigation knowledge also reframes education itself. It shows that learning does not require classrooms or textbooks to be rigorous. It requires structure, mentorship, repetition, and meaning. Ancient navigators trained longer and more intensely than many modern professionals. Their examinations were unforgiving. The ocean did not care about intention. Only results mattered. As interest in traditional navigation grows, it raises a deeper question. If such sophisticated systems existed without writing, what else might humanity have known and forgotten? How many other sciences were once encoded in story, movement, and ritual, only to vanish when their cultural foundations collapsed? The story of ancient mariners is not just about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. It challenges assumptions about knowledge, technology, and what it means to understand the world. It reminds us that the human mind, when trained with patience and respect for nature, is capable of extraordinary feats. And there is still one final dimension of ancient navigation left to explore. One that ties everything together. The mindset of the navigator. The way of thinking that allowed humans to trust waves, stars, winds, and living creatures across vast uncertainty. In the next part of this journey, we'll step inside that mental framework and uncover how ancient mariners learned not just to navigate the ocean, but to think like it. To truly understand how ancient mariners conquered the oceans, we have to step beyond techniques and tools and enter a completely different way of thinking. Navigation for them was not a task that began when a voyage started and ended when land appeared. It was a state of mind cultivated over a lifetime. Ancient navigators did not switch their awareness on and off. They lived inside a continuous relationship with their environment, and that mental framework may have been their most powerful instrument of all. Modern navigation encourages certainty. Numbers, coordinates, digital readouts, and fixed positions give the illusion of control. Ancient navigation embraced uncertainty instead. Mariners accepted that the ocean could not be reduced to exact points on a grid. Instead of demanding precision from the environment, they developed flexibility within themselves. They constantly updated their understanding, integrating new information as conditions shifted. Direction was not something you locked in once. It was something you continuously confirmed. This required extraordinary attention. Navigators were trained to notice subtle changes that most people would never register. A slight alteration in swell rhythm, a barely perceptible shift in wind pressure on the skin, a change in the color of the sea or the texture of cloud edges near the horizon. None of these signs meant much on their own, but together they formed a living stream of data. The navigator's mind became a filter, weighing and cross-checking signals in real time. Crucially, ancient mariners did not panic when information conflicted. Modern systems often assume clean inputs and clear outputs. Traditional navigation accepted ambiguity as normal. When stars were obscured, the navigator leaned more heavily on waves. When winds became unstable, birds and clouds gained importance. Decision-making was adaptive, not rigid. This mental resilience allowed navigators to function effectively in conditions that would overwhelm someone trained to rely on fixed instruments. Another defining feature of the navigator's mindset was patience. Voyages were not rushed. There was no expectation of constant speed or linear progress. Detours were not failures, they were responses. Ancient mariners understood that forcing a course against conditions often led to disaster. Waiting for the right moment, sometimes days or weeks, was a mark of skill, not weakness. And this patience was reinforced culturally, praised in stories, and embodied by respected elders. Memory played a different role here than in modern thinking. Instead of storing static information, navigators maintained dynamic mental models. Routes were not memorized as straight lines, but as sequences of relationships. This star follows that one. This swell strengthens after that island. This bird appears when you are near this current. These relationships could shift depending on season or weather, and navigators learned to adjust without losing orientation. The mind became a flexible map rather than a rigid chart. Perhaps most striking is how deeply navigators trusted the environment. This trust was not blind faith. It was earned through repeated confirmation. When stars rose where they were expected, when waves behaved as taught, when birds led toward land, confidence grew. Over time, navigators developed an intuitive sense of rightness or wrongness in their course. This intuition was not mystical. It was the product of thousands of observations integrated subconsciously. Modern psychology recognizes this kind of expertise as pattern recognition at an elite level. Chess masters, surgeons, and pilots develop similar intuition through experience. Ancient navigators achieved this without written manuals or simulators, using the ocean itself as their training ground. Every voyage was both a mission and a lesson. This mindset also fostered humility. Navigators did not see themselves as masters of the ocean, but as participants within it. Success depended on cooperation, with crew, with ancestors, with natural forces. Arrogance was dangerous. Overconfidence led to missed signs and poor decisions. Many oral traditions include cautionary tales of skilled navigators who failed because they stopped listening. These stories served as psychological safeguards, reminding each generation that expertise required continual respect. There was also a collective dimension to navigation thinking. While one individual might hold the title of navigator, the entire crew participated in awareness. Crew members watched the sea, tracked birds, felt changes in wind. Information flowed constantly to the navigator, who synthesized it into decisions. This distributed attention, reduced error, and strengthened resilience. Navigation was communal cognition, not solitary genius. When modern sailors trained in traditional methods describe their experiences, they often report a profound shift in perception. Time feels different. Anxiety decreases. The ocean feels less hostile and more communicative. Without constant reference to instruments, awareness expands outward. Many describe a sense of belonging, of being part of a system rather than fighting it. This psychological transformation may explain why traditional navigation was not only effective, but deeply meaningful. The loss of this mindset may be one of the greatest hidden costs of technological navigation. Instruments are efficient, but they narrow attention. They encourage dependence rather than awareness. When systems fail, panic often follows, not because the situation is unsolvable, but because the mental framework to solve it has not been cultivated. Ancient navigators trained for failure as much as success. What they expected uncertainty. They prepared for disorientation. They practiced recovery, not just accuracy. This is why they could survive being blown off course or delayed for weeks. They were never truly lost because they never stopped gathering information. Understanding this mindset forces a reevaluation of what it means to be intelligent and skilled. Intelligence here is not abstract calculation. It is deep attunement. Skill is not dominance over nature, but alignment with it. Progress is not measured by how much information is extracted from the world, but by how well one listens to it. This way of thinking did not emerge by accident. It was shaped by generations who depended on it for survival. Oceans punish error ruthlessly. That these systems endured is proof of their effectiveness. They were not romantic ideals. They were practical necessities, refined under extreme pressure. As we look ahead, this ancient mindset may hold lessons for the modern world beyond navigation. In an era of environmental uncertainty, climate instability, and technological dependence, the ability to read complex systems, adapt continuously, and act with humility may be more valuable than ever. The story of ancient mariners is reaching a turning point. We've explored their tools, their environment, their culture, and their mindset. Now it's time to confront the biggest question of all. Why modern history so thoroughly misunderstood these achievements? And what happens when we finally acknowledge that humanity once mastered the oceans in ways we are only beginning to rediscover? In the next batch, we'll dismantle the myth of accidental discovery and expose how ancient voyages were deliberate, planned, and world-changing. For centuries, the dominant explanation for ancient oceanic settlement rested on a single, deeply flawed idea: accident. According to this view, people reached distant islands because storms blew them off course, currents carried them unknowingly, and sheer luck deposited survivors on new shores. It was a convenient explanation. It required no advanced knowledge, no sophisticated planning, and no re-evaluation of long-held assumptions about so-called primitive societies. But when examined closely, the theory of accidental discovery collapses under its own weight. Accidents do not happen repeatedly with precision. They do not follow patterns. They do not produce return voyages, trade networks, or cultural continuity across thousands of miles. Yet this is exactly what the archaeological, linguistic, botanical, and genetic evidence shows. Island societies across vast oceans share common ancestry, shared technologies, related languages, and transported plants and animals. These are not the fingerprints of chance. They are the signatures of intention. Consider the scale of what was accomplished. The Pacific alone covers more area than all the world's land combined. Many islands within it are tiny, low-lying, and invisible until a ship is dangerously close. Missing one by even a few miles could mean sailing past it entirely. If early mariners were merely drifting, the odds of repeatedly finding these islands, let alone settling them successfully, would be astronomically low. Yet humans did not just stumble onto one island. They systematically colonized nearly all of them. Planned voyages explain what accidents cannot. They explain why settlements appear in logical sequences, why expansion paused and resumed in waves, and why colonization often coincided with periods of favorable climate and wind conditions. They explain why people arrived carrying domesticated plants, animals, and tools specifically suited for long-term survival. You do not accidentally bring everything needed to start a new society. You plan for it. The movement of the Lapita people across the Pacific is a striking example. Archaeological sites show a clear eastward progression over generations, marked by distinctive pottery styles and settlement patterns. This was not random drift. It was exploration, followed by deliberate expansion. Scouts would travel first, assess new lands, and return with information. Only then would larger groups follow. This mirrors patterns seen in later, well-documented exploration efforts, differing only in the absence of written records. Return voyages are especially damning to the accident theory. Many islands were settled, abandoned, and resettled. Trade goods moved back and forth across open ocean routes. Cultural practices remained synchronized across great distances. These outcomes require navigational reliability in both directions. Drift can take you somewhere once. It cannot bring you back on schedule. Even the design of ancient vessels argues against accidental discovery. Double-hulled canoes and longships were not survival rafts. They were optimized for speed, stability, cargo capacity, and endurance. Their construction required communal effort, long-term planning, and deep understanding of materials and sea conditions. Such investment makes no sense if voyages were accidental. It makes perfect sense if exploration was intentional. The persistence of the accident narrative says more about modern bias than ancient capability. For a long time, many scholars assumed that complex navigation required writing, mathematics, and instruments. Because ancient mariners used different systems, their achievements were dismissed rather than studied. Oral knowledge was seen as inferior. Environmental literacy was mistaken for intuition rather than science. When experimental voyages began to test traditional navigation methods, the results forced a reckoning. Canoes sailed along predicted routes. Landfalls matched expectations. Voyages succeeded repeatedly. What had been labeled myth turned out to be method. And the ocean did not need to be conquered by force or technology. It could be traversed through understanding. This reframing also changes how we interpret human curiosity. Ancient mariners were not passive victims of nature, pushed around by storms. They were explorers driven by purpose. Some sought new resources. Others followed population pressure, political tension, or spiritual calling. Exploration was embedded in cultural values. The sea was not feared as a void, but respected as a pathway. There is also evidence that ancient navigators understood risk management. Voyages were timed to minimize danger. Routes followed known wind and swell systems. Stopover islands were used strategically. Crews were selected carefully. Knowledge of failure was preserved and acted upon. This is not reckless wandering. It is calculated expansion under uncertainty. Why then did the myth of accidental discovery endure for so long? Part of the answer lies in colonial narratives that framed non-European societies as less capable. Acknowledging intentional, sophisticated exploration by ancient mariners would require rewriting history, redistributing credit, and questioning deeply ingrained hierarchies of knowledge. It was easier to believe in luck than expertise. But that belief is no longer defensible. The convergence of evidence, from archaeology, linguistics, ethnography, and experimental navigation, tells a consistent story. Ancient mariners knew where they were going. They knew how to get there, and they knew how to come back. This realization has profound implications. It means that large portions of the world were explored and connected far earlier than once believed. It means that globalization did not begin in the modern era. It began when humans learned to read the ocean. It also means that human ingenuity does not move in a simple upward line. Knowledge can appear, flourish, and fade, only to be rediscovered later. The idea that ancient voyages were deliberate forces us to confront another uncomfortable truth. Modern society may not be as advanced as it assumes in every domain. In some ways, ancient mariners possessed forms of intelligence we have neglected, skills of attention, memory, and ecological integration that are difficult to recreate once lost. Recognizing intention, where we once saw accident, restores agency to ancient peoples. It honors their courage, discipline, and intellect. It replaces a story of chance survival with one of mastery and vision. And it reminds us that exploration is not defined by the tools you carry, but by how deeply you understand the world you move through. As this picture comes into focus, one final layer emerges. These voyages did not just reshape geography. They reshaped culture, language, and identity across oceans. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore the lasting legacy of ancient navigation, how it transformed societies, connected distant worlds, and continues to influence humanity in ways we are only beginning to recognize. Once ancient mariners proved that oceans could be crossed intentionally, the consequences were transformative. Navigation was never just about movement from one place to another. It reshaped culture itself. Every successful voyage carried more than people and cargo. It carried ideas, languages, technologies, beliefs, and ways of seeing the world. Over generations, these exchanges wove distant islands and coastlines into vast cultural networks, long before the concept of globalization existed. Across the Pacific, remarkable similarities appear among societies separated by thousands of miles. Languages share common roots. Myths echo familiar themes. Canoe designs follow related principles. Even musical instruments and dance forms show shared ancestry. These patterns are not coincidences. They are evidence of sustained contact, memory, and exchange maintained through maritime mobility. Navigation enabled culture to travel, adapt, and evolve across an ocean that once seemed insurmountable. One of the clearest examples lies in agriculture. Many Pacific islands contain plants that are not native to their environments. Taro, breadfruit, sweet potato, banana. These crops did not drift across oceans on their own. They were carried deliberately, protected during long voyages, and cultivated upon arrival. This required planning, foresight, and confidence in successful landfall. Crops became biological proof of navigation skill, rooting human intention into distant landscapes. Animals tell a similar story. Pigs, chickens, and dogs appear on islands where they could never have arrived naturally. Transporting live animals across open ocean is difficult even with modern ships. Ancient mariners managed it repeatedly. These animals reshaped diets, ecosystems, and social practices, embedding maritime connections into daily life. The ocean was not a divider. It was a corridor. Cultural exchange also flowed through story. Oral traditions preserved memories of ancestral voyages, naming islands in sequence, describing winds, currents, and encounters. These stories did not merely entertain. They preserved history and geography simultaneously. A myth about a heroic journey might encode a real route. A tale of exile might describe colonization. Over time, these narratives became identity anchors, reminding communities where they came from and how they arrived. Importantly, this exchange was not one-directional. Islands were not passive recipients of culture. Each settlement adapted what it received, blending old knowledge with new environments. Navigation enabled feedback. Voyagers returned with innovations, stories, and lessons. Techniques improved, designs evolved, cultures remained dynamic rather than isolated. This constant movement helped maintain resilience, allowing societies to respond to change rather than stagnate. In regions like the Indian Ocean, similar processes unfolded on an even larger scale. Trade winds connected Africa, Arabia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Goods moved across thousands of miles, but so did religions, mathematics, art styles, and political ideas. Long before modern empires, maritime routes enabled cultural hybridization. Coastal cities became melting pots, shaped as much by sailors as by kings. Navigation also influenced social organization. Societies that relied on long-distance voyaging often developed strong traditions of cooperation and shared responsibility. Building and sailing large vessels required collective effort. Success depended on trust. Hierarchies existed, but survival demanded collaboration. Leadership was tied to competence, not just authority. A navigator who failed repeatedly did not remain respected for long. This emphasis on competence shaped values. Patience, observation, humility, and respect for elders were not abstract virtues. They were practical necessities. Cultures that preserved navigational knowledge valued memory and listening. Elders were respected because they carried experience. Youth were trained through apprenticeship rather than instruction alone. Knowledge flowed through relationships, not institutions. As these maritime cultures expanded, they left lasting marks on the world's genetic and linguistic landscape. Genetic studies show clear links between populations separated by oceans. Linguistic families spread along navigational routes, branching as communities settled new lands. When these patterns reveal movement with intention, not isolation. Humanity did not slowly creep along coastlines alone. It leapt across water. When navigation knowledge declined under colonial pressure, the cultural consequences were profound. Isolation increased. Inter-island exchange diminished. Oral histories fractured. Communities that once saw themselves as part of vast oceanic networks were reframed as small, isolated groups. This shift altered identity. The ocean transformed in perception, from connector to barrier. The revival of traditional navigation has begun to reverse this psychological shift. Modern voyaging projects often report not only technical success, but cultural renewal. Communities reconnect with ancestral stories. Young people rediscover pride in skills once dismissed as obsolete. The ocean regains its role as a shared heritage rather than an obstacle. This revival has also influenced modern science. Researchers studying human migration, ecology, and cognition increasingly recognize the value of indigenous knowledge systems. Navigation traditions provide insights into how humans process complex information without external aids. They challenge assumptions about intelligence and literacy. They demonstrate that sophisticated science can exist without equations on paper. There is also a deeper philosophical legacy. Ancient mariners embodied a worldview in which humans were not separate from nature, but participants within it. Navigation required cooperation with natural forces, not domination. This perspective contrasts sharply with modern extractive attitudes. As environmental crises intensify, the navigational mindset, adaptive, attentive, respectful, offers lessons far beyond sailing. The cultural impact of ancient navigation extends even into modern language. Words related to direction, journey, and home often carry maritime metaphors in oceanic societies. Life itself is framed as a voyage. Challenges are currents, elders are stars. These metaphors reflect lived experience. They reveal how deeply navigation shaped thought. Understanding this legacy forces a redefinition of what exploration means. It is not merely the act of discovery, it is the creation of connection. Ancient mariners did not explore to conquer. They explored to belong, to expand the web of relationships across water and land. Their success reshaped humanity's story in ways that written history long overlooked. As we approach the final stages of this journey, one question grows unavoidable. If ancient navigation achieved so much with such elegance, why did modern society fail to recognize its value for so long? The answer lies in how history itself is written. Who gets to define knowledge? Whose achievements are recorded? and whose are dismissed. In the next batch, we will confront the role of colonialism, bias, and selective memory in erasing ancient maritime genius, and explore what it means to finally correct the record. To understand why ancient navigation was misunderstood for so long, we have to confront an uncomfortable truth about how history is written. Knowledge does not disappear because it is ineffective. It disappears when the people who hold power decide it does not matter. The erasure of ancient maritime expertise was not accidental. It was the result of colonial systems that valued certain forms of knowledge while dismissing others, often with devastating consequences. When European powers expanded across the oceans, they brought with them new technologies, metal tools, written charts, compasses, and later chronometers. These tools were impressive, and in many contexts, they were genuinely useful. But they came packaged with an ideology that equated technology with superiority. Anything that did not resemble European science was labeled primitive, intuitive, or superstitious. Indigenous navigation systems, deeply empirical yet non-written, were especially vulnerable to this dismissal. European explorers often relied on indigenous pilots to guide them through unfamiliar waters, even while publicly denying the sophistication of those guides. Journals and reports frequently described islanders as lucky drifters or instinct-driven sailors, ignoring the clear evidence of systematic knowledge. This contradiction allowed colonizers to benefit from indigenous expertise, while simultaneously undermining its legitimacy. The knowledge was used, but the people who possessed it were not credited. Colonial education systems accelerated this erasure. Missionary schools discouraged oral traditions, ritual learning, and indigenous languages. Children were taught that their ancestral knowledge was backward or sinful. Navigation chants were replaced with hymns. Stories encoding routes and winds were labeled myths and forgotten. In some cases, traditional sailing itself was actively suppressed, seen as a threat to colonial control over movement and trade. Their maps played a subtle but powerful role in this process. European cartography presented the world as a grid of lines and coordinates, reinforcing the idea that true knowledge was something fixed on paper. Indigenous navigation, which existed in memory and practice, did not fit this model. What could not be drawn, measured, or archived was treated as if it did not exist. Over time, this bias shaped academic research as well. Scholars trained in written traditions struggled to recognize systems that lived outside their familiar frameworks. The result was a historical narrative that credited Europeans with discovering oceans that had already been crossed for centuries. Islands were said to be found, even when their inhabitants had long maintained trade routes and cultural ties across vast distances. The exploration was redefined as something that only counted when it was written down. Everything else became prehistory, folklore, or legend. This selective memory had real consequences. When traditional navigation declined, communities became more dependent on imported technologies. Local autonomy weakened. Cultural confidence eroded. The ocean, once a shared highway, became a boundary enforced by colonial economies and borders. People who had once moved freely across water were suddenly confined to small territories, their histories reframed as isolated and static. It was not until the 20th century that this narrative began to crack. Archaeological discoveries revealed clear patterns of settlement inconsistent with accidental drift. Linguistic studies traced connections across oceans. Genetic research confirmed shared ancestry. At the same time, indigenous elders began speaking openly about navigation traditions that had survived in fragments. Scholars who listened truly listened, realized that something extraordinary had been overlooked. Experimental voyages became a turning point. When traditional methods were tested under real conditions and succeeded, denial became impossible. The ocean itself became evidence. Each successful landfall was a rebuttal to centuries of dismissal. These voyages did not romanticize the past. They demonstrated practicality. They showed that ancient systems worked not in theory, but in reality. This reevaluation has forced historians and scientists to confront deeper biases. Why was written knowledge privileged over oral knowledge? Why were instruments trusted more than trained senses? Why was memory seen as unreliable, despite evidence to the contrary? These questions extend beyond navigation. They apply to medicine, ecology, astronomy, and many other fields where indigenous knowledge was sidelined. Correcting the record is not simply about giving credit where it is due. It changes how we understand human potential. It reveals that intelligence is not confined to laboratories or textbooks. It shows that science can be embedded in culture, transmitted through story, and refined without formal institutions. It challenges the assumption that progress always moves forward, suggesting instead that knowledge can be lost, ignored, and later rediscovered. There is also a moral dimension to this correction. Recognizing ancient navigation honors the communities that preserved fragments of this knowledge under immense pressure. It validates elders who were told their teachings were worthless. It restores agency to societies that were portrayed as passive or accidental participants in history. This recognition is not charity. It is accuracy. Modern education is beginning to reflect this shift, albeit slowly. Navigation is now studied as a cognitive science, a systems-based approach to problem-solving under uncertainty. Indigenous methods are cited not as curiosities, but as case studies in expert performance. The ocean, once again, becomes a classroom, yet challenges remain. Much knowledge was lost before it could be recorded or revived. Languages disappeared, lineages were broken. What survives is only a portion of what once existed. This makes the remaining fragments all the more precious. Each chant remembered, each route retraced, each story reclaimed is a recovery of human heritage. Understanding how colonialism distorted the history of navigation is essential to grasping the full scope of ancient maritime achievement. It explains not only why these feats were forgotten, but why their rediscovery feels so surprising today. We were not missing the evidence. We were missing the willingness to see it. As the record is corrected, a new question emerges. What does this rediscovered knowledge mean for the future? Is ancient navigation merely a historical curiosity, or does it offer tools and perspectives still relevant in a modern, uncertain world? In the next batch, we will explore how traditional navigation is influencing contemporary science, sustainability, and education, and why its lessons may be more urgent now than ever before. As ancient navigation is rediscovered, it is becoming increasingly clear that this knowledge does not belong only to the past. What once guided canoes across open oceans is now reshaping how modern scientists, educators, and navigators think about uncertainty, sustainability, and human perception. Traditional navigation is no longer viewed as a historical curiosity. It is emerging as a living system with practical relevance in a world facing environmental instability and technological dependence. One of the most striking areas of influence is cognitive science. Researchers studying how expert navigators operate without instruments have gained new insights into how the human brain processes complex, dynamic information. Traditional navigators demonstrate an ability to integrate multiple sensory inputs simultaneously: waves, wind, stars, birds, clouds, without becoming overwhelmed. This challenges the assumption that humans require external tools to manage complexity. Instead, it suggests that cognition itself can be trained to handle systems far richer than most modern environments demand. These findings have implications far beyond the ocean. Pilots, surgeons, emergency responders, and even astronauts operate in high-risk settings where information is incomplete and conditions change rapidly. The navigator's mindset, adaptive, attentive, calm under uncertainty, offers a model for decision-making that does not rely on perfect data. It emphasizes resilience over precision, awareness over control. In a world increasingly shaped by unpredictability, this approach may be more valuable than ever. Environmental science has also begun to take traditional navigation seriously. Indigenous navigators possess intimate knowledge of ocean currents, seasonal wind patterns, animal behavior, and long-term ecological cycles. Much of this information was gathered through centuries of observation, creating data sets that extend far beyond the lifespan of modern scientific studies. As climate change alters weather systems and ocean behavior, this historical perspective is invaluable. It provides context, revealing which changes are unprecedented and which fall within natural variability. Some climate researchers now collaborate with indigenous knowledge holders to better understand shifting wind patterns, changing migration routes, and altered wave behavior. Traditional observations often detect changes earlier than instruments because they are embedded in daily experience. When navigators say the ocean no longer behaves as it once did, they are not speaking metaphorically. They are reporting data grounded in lived comparison across generations. Education is another field being transformed. Navigation programs based on traditional methods have been introduced in schools and community initiatives, not only to preserve culture, but to teach broader skills. Students learning wayfinding report, improved memory, focus, and spatial reasoning. They learn patience, teamwork, and humility, qualities rarely emphasized in standardized curricula. Learning to navigate without instruments forces students to slow down and pay attention, cultivating a relationship with the environment rather than treating it as background noise. These programs also restore a sense of belonging. For communities whose histories were disrupted by colonial narratives, reclaiming navigation is an act of cultural healing. It reconnects youth with ancestors not as abstract figures, but as skilled scientists and explorers. Pride replaces shame. Curiosity replaces detachment. The ocean becomes a source of identity rather than loss. Modern sailors experimenting with traditional techniques often describe a similar transformation. Without constant reference to screens, their awareness expands outward. They notice patterns they once ignored. Anxiety decreases as trust in environmental cues grows. Navigation becomes less about fighting conditions and more about working with them. Even when modern tools are available, sailors report that traditional skills provide a deeper layer of security, a backup that no battery failure can erase. This blending of old and new is not about rejecting technology. It is about balance. Traditional navigation reminds us that tools should extend human perception, not replace it. Over-reliance on automation can dull awareness, leaving individuals helpless when systems fail. By contrast, navigators trained in environmental literacy remain capable even under extreme disruption. They carry the system within themselves. The relevance of this lesson extends into space exploration. Space agencies study how astronauts navigate and orient themselves in environments where traditional reference points disappear. The challenges are surprisingly similar to those faced by ancient mariners. Disorientation, sensory deprivation, and reliance on instruments all play roles. Studying how navigators maintained orientation across featureless oceans offers unexpected insights into how humans might better adapt to life beyond Earth. There is also a philosophical shift underway. Traditional navigation challenges the modern tendency to separate humans from nature. It reveals a worldview in which intelligence is relational rather than extractive. Knowledge emerges through interaction, not domination. This perspective aligns closely with emerging sustainability ethics, which emphasize coexistence over control. In an era defined by ecological limits, the navigator's way of thinking feels not ancient, but ahead of its time. Yet this revival faces challenges. Much knowledge was lost, and what remains often survives in fragments. Reviving navigation requires patience, respect, and collaboration. It cannot be rushed or extracted. Communities must lead the process, deciding how and when knowledge is shared. Outsiders who treat traditional navigation as a toolkit rather than a culture risk, repeating the same patterns of exploitation that led to its suppression. There is also the danger of romanticization. Ancient navigation was not perfect or easy. It demanded immense discipline and carried real risk. Lives were lost. Mistakes were unforgiving. Respecting this reality prevents the knowledge from being turned into myth. Its power lies not in nostalgia, but in demonstrated effectiveness under extreme conditions. As traditional navigation re-enters modern discourse, it forces a reconsideration of what progress means. Progress is often imagined as moving away from the past, replacing older systems with newer ones. But navigation shows a different pattern. Some forms of knowledge do not become obsolete. They become neglected. When rediscovered, they feel revolutionary because they address problems modern systems struggle to solve. The growing recognition of ancient maritime expertise is part of a larger shift toward plural knowledge systems. Science no longer has to be singular in form to be rigorous. Oral traditions, embodied practice, and long-term observation can coexist with instruments and equations. Together, they create a richer understanding of reality than either could alone. As humanity faces rising seas, changing winds, and uncertain futures, the wisdom of those who once crossed the world's greatest oceans without modern tools feels newly relevant. Ancient mariners navigated uncertainty, not by eliminating it, but by learning to live within it. That lesson may be their greatest gift to the modern world. And yet, there is one final dimension still to be explored. Beyond techniques, cultures, and applications lies a deeper question about human nature itself. What does ancient navigation reveal about who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of when we truly learn to listen? In the next batch, we will bring this journey toward its philosophical core, examining how the story of ancient mariners reshapes our understanding of humanity's place in the world. When we strip ancient navigation down to its deepest layer, what remains is not technique, technology, or even culture, but a profound insight into human nature itself. The story of ancient mariners forces us to confront a question modern society rarely asks. What are humans capable of when knowledge, attention, and environment are fully aligned? Long before satellites and algorithms, humans crossed the largest featureless spaces on Earth, and did so repeatedly, intentionally, and successfully. That fact alone reshapes our understanding of intelligence. Ancient navigation reveals that human cognition evolved not merely to survive on land, but to engage with vast, dynamic systems. The open ocean is one of the most complex environments imaginable. It offers few fixed reference points, constant motion, and high stakes for error. That humans learned to read it with such precision suggests that the human mind is far more adaptable than modern frameworks often allow. Sui. We are not limited to abstract symbols and external tools. We are pattern recognizers capable of integrating immense streams of information through experience. This realization challenges the modern tendency to equate intelligence with calculation. Ancient navigators rarely counted or measured in the way we do today. Instead, they perceived relationships between stars and seasons, waves and wind, birds and land. Their intelligence was relational rather than numerical. It was grounded in context, meaning, and continuous feedback. Modern science increasingly recognizes this form of cognition as equally valid, especially in complex systems where variables cannot be fully controlled. There is also a deeper philosophical implication. Ancient mariners did not experience the ocean as an adversary to be conquered. They experienced it as a partner to be understood. This stands in stark contrast to narratives of domination that dominate modern exploration stories. The ocean was powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it was not hostile. It followed rules. Those who learned those rules could move within them. This worldview fosters humility, patience, and respect, qualities often absent in modern narratives of progress. The human urge to explore, seen through this lens, takes on new meaning. Exploration was not driven solely by conquest or exploitation. It was driven by curiosity, necessity, and connection. Ancient voyages often sought not to claim land, but to expand relationships, to find kin, resources, or balance. This reframes exploration as a social act rather than an imperial one. Humans crossed oceans not just to reach new places, but to weave themselves into a larger world. Navigation also reveals something profound about trust. Ancient mariners trusted their environment, their training, and each other. This trust was not naive. It was built through repeated confirmation and shared experience. Modern systems often replace trust with control, more instruments, more redundancy, more data. While this can increase safety, it can also erode confidence in human judgment. Ancient navigation reminds us that trust, when earned, can be a powerful stabilizing force. Memory emerges here, not as a fragile substitute for written records, but as a sophisticated technology in its own right. Oral systems stored not just information, but context, ethics, and caution. They taught not only how to navigate, but how to behave while navigating. Mistakes were remembered as stories. Successes became models. Memory linked knowledge to responsibility. In this way, navigation was as much about moral orientation as spatial direction. The loss of these systems reveals another uncomfortable truth. Modern humanity may be less resilient in certain ways than our ancestors. When external systems fail, many people are left disoriented. Ancient mariners trained for failure as part of success. They expected uncertainty. They developed comfort with not knowing everything at once. This psychological resilience may be one of the most valuable lessons ancient navigation offers a world facing increasing instability. There is also a spiritual dimension that modern analysis often overlooks. For many cultures, navigation was inseparable from cosmology. Stars were ancestors. Winds had personalities. The ocean was alive with memory. While modern science may interpret these beliefs symbolically, their functional effect was real. They fostered attentiveness, respect, and ethical restraint. Navigators did not act recklessly because they believed their actions mattered beyond themselves. In an age of environmental crisis, This ethic feels urgently relevant. Ancient navigation also reframes the idea of limits. Modern thinking often assumes that without advanced tools, certain feats are impossible. History tells a different story. Humans crossed oceans without engines. They tracked time without clocks. They navigated space without coordinates. Limits were not fixed barriers. They were challenges to be met through adaptation. This perspective encourages humility about what we label impossible today. The rediscovery of ancient maritime knowledge is not about nostalgia or romanticism. It is about expanding our understanding of what it means to know something. It invites us to recognize that knowledge can be embodied, ecological, and collective. It can live in song, story, and practice without losing rigor. When modern society dismisses these forms, it narrows its own potential. At its core, the story of ancient mariners is a story of relationship between humans and the planet they inhabit. Oceans were not empty voids separating continents. They were connective tissue, carrying people, ideas, and life itself. Navigation made humanity a planetary species long before the modern age acknowledged it. This realization alters our place in history. Humans were not confined. Timid creatures slowly pushing outward from safe shores. We were bold, observant, and deeply attuned to the world. We listened, we learned, we moved. As this journey nears its conclusion, one final question remains. If ancient mariners could master the oceans with such elegance, what does that demand of us today? How might modern humanity navigate its own uncertain seas, technological, environmental, and moral, using lessons refined over thousands of years? In the next batch, we will draw these threads together, exploring how the wisdom of ancient navigation offers not just historical insight, but guidance for the future of human exploration itself. As the lessons of ancient navigation come into focus, they begin to feel less like history and more like instruction. What these mariners achieved was not a miracle of luck or a fluke of circumstance. It was the result of a mindset that modern humanity is only beginning to appreciate again. They navigated uncertainty, not by eliminating it, but by learning how to move within it, with awareness, patience, and humility. In doing so, they offer a template for navigating challenges far beyond the ocean. Modern society is obsessed with prediction. We model, forecast, calculate, and simulate in an attempt to remove uncertainty from the future. Yet the world we face is increasingly unpredictable. Climate systems shift faster than models can adapt. Technologies evolve faster than ethics can keep pace. Information multiplies faster than understanding. In this context, ancient navigation offers a radically different strategy. Instead of demanding certainty, it trains responsiveness. Instead of controlling the system, it cultivates alignment with it. Ancient mariners accepted that the ocean would never be fully known. They did not attempt to dominate it through force or abstraction. They learned its tendencies, respected its limits, and adjusted constantly. This approach mirrors how complex systems actually behave. Oceans, climates, ecosystems, and even societies are not machines with fixed inputs and outputs. They are living systems with feedback loops, thresholds, and emergent behavior. Navigators who survived learned to read these patterns intuitively. This is why traditional navigation maps so well onto modern challenges. Climate adaptation, for example, requires more than precise data. It requires local knowledge, long-term observation, and the ability to respond as conditions change. Ancient navigators did exactly this. They noticed subtle shifts over time. They compared present conditions with remembered ones. They adapted routes, timing, and behavior accordingly. Their success depended on attentiveness, rather than prediction. There is also a lesson here about scale. Modern systems often attempt to manage problems from a distance, using centralized models and top-down control. Ancient navigation was inherently local and embodied. Knowledge lived where it was applied. Decisions were made by those directly experiencing conditions. This decentralization increased resilience. When one navigator failed, knowledge still existed within the community. When one route became unsafe, others could be explored. The future of exploration may depend on reclaiming this balance. Whether navigating polar regions, deep oceans, or even other planets, humans will face environments where instruments can fail and conditions can change faster than data can be processed. In these contexts, human perception, judgment, and adaptability will remain irreplaceable. Ancient navigation demonstrates that these qualities can be trained to extraordinary levels. There is also a social lesson embedded in these systems. Ancient voyages were collective efforts. Success depended on trust, cooperation, and shared responsibility. The navigator did not act alone. Crew members contributed observations, elders contributed memory. The community supported preparation and learning. Modern societies often frame problem-solving as an individual or institutional task. Ancient navigation reminds us that resilience is communal. This has implications for how knowledge is valued. Traditional navigation thrived because knowledge was respected, protected, and practiced continuously. It was not treated as disposable or replaceable. In contrast, modern knowledge systems often prioritize speed and novelty over depth and continuity. Skills become obsolete quickly. Expertise is fragmented. Ancient mariners show the power of slow knowledge, knowledge that deepens over generations and becomes more reliable, not less. Another crucial lesson lies in restraint. Ancient navigators knew when not to sail. They waited for the right season, the right winds, the right signs. This patience is striking in a world driven by urgency and optimization. Modern systems often push forward despite warnings, driven by economic or political pressure. Ancient navigation valued timing as much as direction. Moving at the wrong moment was more dangerous than not moving at all. The ethical dimension of this restraint is important. Navigators were accountable not only for reaching their destination, but for the lives entrusted to them. Decisions carried moral weight. This sense of responsibility is often diluted in modern systems, where consequences are abstracted or distributed. Ancient navigation ties decision-making directly to human impact, reinforcing care and caution. The rediscovery of these principles also reshapes our understanding of innovation. Innovation is often portrayed as the creation of something entirely new. Ancient navigation shows another path: refinement. Over centuries, navigators improved not by sudden breakthroughs, but by incremental learning. Small adjustments accumulated into robust systems. This evolutionary approach to knowledge may be better suited to long-term survival than disruptive change. As humanity stands at the edge of new frontiers, artificial intelligence, space exploration, environmental transformation, the temptation to rely solely on technology is strong. Ancient mariners caution against this imbalance. Tools are powerful, but they must be grounded in human judgment and environmental awareness. When tools replace perception rather than extend it, vulnerability increases. There is also a narrative shift required. History often celebrates conquerors and inventors, those who impose order on the world. Ancient navigators offer a different hero: the listener, the observer, the one who moves gently through complexity without breaking it. This is a quieter form of mastery, but no less profound. Ultimately, in the story of ancient mariners, is a story about relationship with the earth, with each other, and with uncertainty itself. They remind us that exploration is not about escaping the planet, but about learning how to live within it more wisely. Oceans were not obstacles to overcome, but teachers to learn from. The same may be true of the challenges we face today. As we approach the final chapters of this journey, one realization becomes unavoidable. Ancient navigation was not a primitive stage waiting to be replaced. It was a peak of human-environment integration that modern society has yet to fully replicate. Recognizing this does not diminish modern achievement. It enriches it, offering guidance drawn from deep time. In the next batch, we will bring this story toward its conclusion by returning to where it began, the open ocean, and reflect on what it truly means to conquer it. Not through domination, but through understanding. Not by force, but by wisdom, passed hand to hand across generations. When we return to the open ocean with everything we now understand, the idea of conquering it takes on an entirely different meaning. Ancient mariners did not conquer the sea by overpowering it. They did so by learning how to belong within it. The ocean was never an enemy to be defeated, nor a void to be endured. It was a living system with rules, rhythms, and moods, and mastery came from listening long enough to recognize them. This perspective stands in sharp contrast to many modern narratives of exploration, which frame success as dominance. Bigger ships, stronger engines, and faster routes. Progress measured by how completely humans can insulate themselves from nature. Ancient navigation followed the opposite logic. The more closely sailors aligned themselves with natural forces, the safer and more efficient their journeys became. Vulnerability was not eliminated. It was managed through understanding. The ocean rewards this kind of attention. Its patterns are subtle, but consistent. Swells remember distant storms. Winds follow seasonal promises. Stars repeat their journeys with cosmic reliability. Life gathers where conditions allow it to flourish. None of this is chaotic when viewed over time. Chaos only appears when we expect the sea to behave like a machine, rather than a system. Ancient mariners learned this early. They accepted that the ocean could not be forced into straight lines or fixed schedules. Routes curved, timelines flexed, voyages unfolded according to conditions rather than deadlines. This flexibility was not inefficiency. It was intelligence, adapted to reality. Modern shipping often rediscovers this truth the hard way, when rigid plans collide with weather, currents, or mechanical failure. Understanding the ocean as a pathway, rather than a barrier, also reshapes how we think about distance. On land, distance is measured by miles or kilometers. At sea, distance is relational. It is shaped by wind, swell, and time. Two islands separated by hundreds of miles may be closer, in practical terms, than two land masses divided by mountains or deserts. Ancient mariners understood this intuitively. Their mental maps were not scaled drawings, but lived experiences of effort and flow. This is why ancient routes sometimes appear counterintuitive on modern maps. Voyages might arc far from a straight line, following winds or swell systems that made travel easier and safer. From a satellite view, these routes look inefficient. From the perspective of a canoe and crew, they are optimal. The ocean defines efficiency differently than abstract geometry. There is also a deeper emotional dimension to this way of traveling. Ancient voyagers developed an intimate relationship with uncertainty. Days passed without landmarks. Nights unfolded under unfamiliar stars. Yet fear did not dominate the experience. Confidence came from engagement rather than control. Each sign read correctly reinforced trust. Each successful landfall affirmed that the world was knowable, even without complete certainty. This emotional resilience is perhaps one of the most underappreciated achievements of ancient navigation. Modern systems often attempt to eliminate anxiety through control and prediction. When those systems fail, anxiety returns with force. Ancient navigators trained themselves to coexist with uncertainty. They expected it. They prepared for it. As a result, they were less shaken by it. The crew's relationship to the voyage was also different. Travel was not something endured in isolation. It was shared. Songs were sung, stories were told, observations were exchanged. Time was marked by stars and meals rather than clocks. This communal rhythm helped maintain morale and awareness. Navigation was not just technical labor, it was social life unfolding on water. This sense of shared purpose extended beyond the voyage itself. Successful journeys became part of collective memory. They were retold, celebrated, and studied. Each voyage strengthened the cultural fabric, reinforcing knowledge and identity. Failure, too, became part of this memory, carrying lessons forward. The ocean shaped culture as much as culture shaped ocean travel. When we look at the cumulative result of these practices, the scale is staggering. Humans settled nearly every habitable island across the Pacific. They maintained networks across the Indian Ocean and beyond. They did so without writing, without engines, without instruments as we define them today. The achievement is not diminished by the absence of modern technology. It is magnified by it. This forces a reconsideration of what advancement truly means. Advancement is often equated with increasing distance from nature, with replacing perception by automation. Ancient navigation suggests another path. Advancement can mean deeper integration, more refined attention, greater respect for complexity. It can mean knowing when to act and when to wait, knowing when to trust and when to turn back. In this sense, ancient mariners did not merely conquer the oceans. They transformed humanity's relationship with the planet. They demonstrated that vastness does not require domination, that danger does not require denial, and that uncertainty does not require paralysis. It requires skill, patience, and humility. This lesson resonates far beyond maritime history. Modern humanity faces oceans of its own: climate change, technological acceleration, global interdependence. These are complex systems with no simple maps and no guaranteed routes. Attempts to dominate them through force or prediction alone have repeatedly failed. What ancient navigation offers is a different strategy. Learn the system, listen carefully, adapt continuously, and move with respect. The ocean teaches that no single perspective is enough. Waves alone are insufficient without stars. Stars alone are insufficient without wind. Wind alone is insufficient without life. Knowledge emerges from synthesis. The same may be true of the challenges we face today. No single discipline, technology, or ideology can navigate them alone. As we near the end of this journey, it becomes clear that ancient navigation is not just about where humans went, but about how they thought, felt, and related to the world while going there. It reveals a form of intelligence grounded in relationship rather than control, a form of courage grounded in attentiveness rather than force. The open ocean remains vast. It always will. What ancient mariners proved is that vastness does not make understanding impossible. It simply demands a different way of knowing, one that modern humanity is only beginning to remember. In the next batch, we will draw together all these threads: science, culture, mindset, and meaning, and confront the final question. What does it truly mean to be a navigator in any age? And what does the legacy of ancient mariners demand of us as we chart the future? At this point in the journey, the word navigator no longer refers only to someone steering a vessel across water. It describes a way of engaging with the world. Ancient mariners were navigators not because they crossed oceans, but because they learned how to move through uncertainty with clarity, discipline, and respect. Their legacy forces us to ask what navigation really means in any era, including our own. Navigation, at its core, is about orientation. It is about knowing where you are, understanding where you want to go, and responding intelligently to the conditions between those 2 points. Ancient navigators understood that none of these elements were fixed. Position shifted constantly. Goals evolved. Conditions changed without warning. The skill lay not in eliminating these changes, but in staying oriented despite them. This is a profoundly transferable skill, one that applies far beyond the sea. Modern life is saturated with information, yet many people feel increasingly disoriented. We have more data than any generation before us, but less certainty about direction. Ancient mariners faced the opposite situation. They had limited information, but deep understanding. They knew which signals mattered and which could be ignored. They filtered noise from meaning. This ability to prioritize attention may be one of their most relevant lessons. The ancient navigators' approach to decision-making was iterative rather than absolute. Course corrections were constant and expected. No single choice defined success or failure. Progress emerged from a series of small adjustments guided by feedback. Modern systems often seek optimal solutions up front, assuming stable conditions. When those assumptions break, the system struggles. Navigation teaches that adaptability is more reliable than optimization. There is also an ethical dimension to navigation that ancient mariners understood intuitively. A navigator was responsible not just for reaching a destination, but for the lives entrusted to them. Decisions were weighed not only for efficiency, but for safety, sustainability, and long-term consequence. This sense of responsibility shaped leadership. Authority was earned through competence and care, not imposed by title alone. In many ways, modern leadership could learn from this model. In business, politics, and technology, decisions often affect people far removed from the decision-maker. Consequences are abstracted. Ancient navigation kept consequences immediate and personal. If a navigator ignored warning signs, people suffered. This proximity fostered humility and caution. It encouraged leaders to listen before acting. Another critical lesson lies in preparation. Ancient voyages were not spontaneous acts of bravery. They were the culmination of years of training, observation, and communal planning. Launching a canoe without adequate preparation was considered irresponsible, not heroic. This contrasts sharply with modern narratives that glorify risk-taking without sufficient grounding. Ancient navigation valued readiness over bravado. The navigator's relationship with time also offers insight. Time was not segmented into minutes and hours, but experienced through cycles, day and night, seasons, winds, stars. This cyclical understanding fostered patience. Progress was measured in alignment, not speed. In a world obsessed with acceleration, this perspective invites reflection. Faster is not always better. Sometimes it is simply more fragile. Ancient mariners also remind us that knowledge is not neutral. How it is transmitted shapes how it is used. Navigation knowledge was embedded in story, ritual, and social obligation. It was difficult to separate skill from ethics. This integration reduced misuse. In contrast, modern technical knowledge is often divorced from moral context. leading to powerful tools without equally powerful guidance on their use. The revival of traditional navigation has made this clear to many practitioners. Learning the techniques without understanding the cultural framework feels incomplete. The skills demand respect for the environment and for the people who preserved them. This challenges extractive approaches to knowledge, where techniques are taken without acknowledging their origins or responsibilities. As we think about the future, whether navigating climate uncertainty, technological transformation, or even space exploration, the ancient navigator's mindset becomes increasingly relevant. These are environments with incomplete information, delayed feedback, and high stakes. Instruments will help, but they will not be sufficient. Human judgment, adaptability, and ethical orientation will remain essential. The story of ancient mariners also reframes human ambition. Exploration was not about escaping the known world, but expanding it thoughtfully. New lands were integrated into existing networks rather than treated as disposable frontiers. This contrasts with modern frontier narratives that often prioritize extraction over relationship. Ancient navigation suggests a different ethic of expansion, one rooted in care and continuity. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of this legacy is its reminder that humans have faced immense uncertainty before and prevailed. The open ocean was once the ultimate unknown. It inspired fear, awe, and doubt. Yet humans learned its language and crossed it with confidence. This does not mean all challenges are the same, but it does mean that despair is not inevitable. Capacity grows with attention and effort. To be a navigator, then, is not simply to know where you are going. It is to remain attentive while going there. It is to adjust without losing purpose. It is to respect forces larger than yourself while still moving forward. Ancient mariners embodied this balance. They were neither reckless nor timid. They were responsive. As this story moves toward its conclusion, the legacy of ancient navigation stands clear. It is not a relic of a vanished world. It is a living philosophy of movement through complexity, one that values listening over forcing, patience over speed, and relationship over control. In the next batch, we will bring this legacy to its final horizon. We will look back across everything ancient mariners achieved and ask what it means to truly conquer an ocean, and whether the greatest conquest was not of water and distance, but of fear, ignorance, and disconnection. By the time we reach this point in the story, the word conquest feels almost misleading. Ancient mariners did not conquer the oceans in the way empires conquer territory. There were no flags planted in water, no permanent claims staked on waves. And yet, something profound was undeniably achieved. Humans transformed the largest, the most intimidating spaces on Earth from barriers into pathways. That transformation was not physical. It was psychological, cultural, and intellectual. The true conquest was fear. For early humans, the open ocean represented uncertainty at its most extreme. No shelter, no landmarks, no guarantee of return. To step into that environment required more than courage. It required confidence grounded in understanding. Ancient navigators did not eliminate fear by ignoring danger. They eliminated it by replacing the unknown with knowledge. Every star memorized, every swell understood, every bird observed, reduced the space where fear could grow. This shift from fear to familiarity changed how humans perceived the planet. Once the ocean became legible, distance shrank. Isolation dissolved. Islands were no longer lonely dots in endless water. They were nodes in a network. The world expanded not because land increased, but because connection did. This is one of the most radical transformations in human history, and it happened without writing, without engines, and without centralized states. The conquest of ignorance followed closely behind. Ignorance is not simply the absence of information. It is the absence of relationship. Ancient mariners replaced ignorance with intimacy. They knew how the ocean behaved at dawn, at dusk, during certain moons, in certain seasons. They knew its moods. This knowledge was earned slowly, through repetition and humility. It could not be rushed or extracted. It demanded attention. In many ways, ancient navigation represents a victory of patience over impulse. No navigator could succeed by acting on impatience alone. Waiting for the right wind, the right season, the right signs was essential. This patience was not passive. It was active readiness. Crews prepared while waiting. Canoes were maintained. Knowledge was rehearsed. When the moment came, action was decisive. Contrast this with modern approaches to challenge, which often prioritize speed and disruption. Ancient mariners remind us that endurance often matters more than acceleration. The longest journeys were completed not by those who moved fastest, but by those who moved most wisely. There was also a conquest of isolation at the human level. Voyages were communal acts. Even when one navigator held authority, success depended on shared vigilance and cooperation. No one crossed an ocean alone. This collective engagement built trust and resilience. It also ensured that knowledge survived beyond any single individual. When a navigator died, the system did not vanish. It lived on in the community. This communal dimension is especially important when considering how navigation knowledge endured for centuries. Written systems preserve information, but they do not guarantee understanding. Ancient navigation preserved understanding through practice. Knowledge stayed alive because it was used. Skills that were not practiced were allowed to fade. This natural selection of knowledge ensured relevance and reliability. The conquest of limitation is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of all. Without metal instruments, without precise measurements, without external memory storage, ancient mariners achieved accuracy that still astonishes modern observers. This forces us to reconsider the limits we assume exist today. Chiwa. How many constraints we accept as absolute are actually cultural assumptions? How many abilities lie dormant because we no longer train them? Ancient navigation suggests that human potential is highly plastic. With the right training and cultural support, people can develop extraordinary capacities for perception, memory, and judgment. These capacities did not vanish because they were inferior. They vanished because they were no longer required by dominant systems. The potential remains. The ocean also taught ancient mariners acceptance. Some voyages failed. Some crews were lost. Not every journey ended in success. These losses were not hidden or denied. They became part of the collective memory, shaping future decisions. This honest relationship with failure contrasts with modern tendencies to conceal or minimize error. Ancient navigation treated failure as information, painful but necessary. This approach created wisdom rather than mere experience. Experience alone does not guarantee learning. Wisdom emerges when experience is reflected upon, shared, and integrated into future action. Oral traditions excelled at this. Stories carried emotional weight, ensuring lessons were remembered not just intellectually, but viscerally. As we stand on this horizon, the ancient mariner's achievement appears less like a technological feat and more like a human one. It was not about mastering nature, but about mastering attention. Not about overpowering the world, but about understanding it deeply enough to move within it safely. This reframing matters because it offers a different model of success for our own time. Modern humanity often measures conquest in terms of extraction, control, and dominance. Ancient navigation offers another metric: connection, continuity, and care. Oceans were crossed not to exploit them, but to belong within a larger system of relationships. The legacy of ancient mariners is not confined to history books or revival voyages. It lives in every moment when humans choose to listen rather than force, to adapt rather than dominate, to move thoughtfully rather than blindly. It lives wherever uncertainty is met with curiosity instead of fear. As we prepare to bring this journey toward its final conclusion, one realization stands above all others. The greatest ocean ancient mariners ever crossed was not made of water. It was the space between ignorance and understanding, between fear and trust, between isolation and connection. In the next batch, we will look directly at that legacy and ask the final question this story demands. If ancient mariners could navigate the unknown with such grace, what responsibility does that place on us as we face the uncharted waters of our own future? Standing at the edge of this story, it becomes clear that ancient navigation is not simply a record of what humanity once did. It is a question posed to what humanity will do next. The oceans ancient mariners crossed were real, dangerous, and vast, but they were finite. The oceans we face today are conceptual as much as physical. Climate instability, technological acceleration, ecological collapse, and global interdependence. Like the open sea, these challenges offer no fixed landmarks and no guaranteed routes. They demand navigation, not domination. The ancient mariners teach us that the first step in navigating uncertainty is acknowledging it. They did not pretend the ocean was safe or predictable. They respected its power. Modern society often struggles with this step, oscillating between denial and panic. Climate data is ignored until disaster strikes. Technological risks are downplayed until consequences become unavoidable. Ancient navigators remind us that clarity begins with honest observation. Once uncertainty was acknowledged, ancient mariners trained relentlessly. They did not wait until a voyage began to learn how to read stars or waves. Training was continuous, embedded in daily life. Modern humanity often attempts to solve crises reactively, scrambling after problems emerge. Ancient navigation suggests a different approach. Cultivate skill long before it is urgently needed. Prepare minds, not just tools. There is also a lesson here about scale and humility. Ancient navigators knew they were small in comparison to the ocean. This awareness did not paralyze them. It sharpened them. Humility encouraged attentiveness. It reduced arrogance. Modern systems often assume that scale grants control, that larger models, faster computers, and bigger infrastructures will automatically solve complex problems. Ancient mariners warn against this assumption. Scale without understanding amplifies risk. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is about integration. Ancient navigation worked because it integrated multiple systems: astronomy, oceanography, ecology, psychology, into a coherent whole. No single discipline dominated. Each informed the others. Modern problem-solving often fragments knowledge into isolated fields, in struggling to reconnect them when real-world complexity demands synthesis. The navigator's way of thinking is inherently interdisciplinary. This integration extended beyond knowledge into values. Navigation was inseparable from ethics. Decisions affected lives immediately. Overfishing, reckless sailing, or ignoring signs had direct consequences. This proximity enforced responsibility. In contrast, Modern systems often distance decision-makers from consequences, allowing harmful patterns to persist. Ancient navigation argues for re-embedding ethics into action. There is also a lesson about leadership. The ancient navigator was not a tyrant issuing commands, nor a passive figurehead. They were a listener, a synthesizer, a steady presence amid uncertainty. Authority came from trust, earned through competence and care. When conditions changed, navigators adapted without losing direction. This model of leadership is urgently needed in a world facing rapid change and eroding trust. Technology itself is not the enemy of this worldview. Ancient mariners were innovators. They refined canoe design, sail shapes, and navigation techniques continuously. The difference lies in how technology was used. Tools extended perception rather than replacing it. They were subordinate to judgment, not substitutes for it. Modern technology often inverts this relationship, encouraging dependence rather than skill. Rebalancing this dynamic is one of the central challenges of our time. Ancient navigation also reframes progress as something cyclical rather than linear. Knowledge can be gained, lost, and regained. The disappearance of traditional navigation was not inevitable. It was contingent. Its revival proves that forgotten wisdom can return when conditions allow. This should inspire caution about dismissing existing knowledge systems today. What we ignore now may be desperately needed later. There is a quiet optimism embedded in this story. Humanity has faced profound uncertainty before and adapted successfully. The ancestors who crossed oceans without instruments were not superhuman. They were attentive, disciplined, and committed to learning. Their achievements suggest that humans are capable of far more than current systems often assume, provided we create cultures that support deep skill and responsibility. The metaphor of navigation extends naturally to the future of exploration beyond Earth. Space, like the ocean, is vast, hostile, and unforgiving. Instruments will be essential, but they will not be enough. Astronauts already train to operate when systems fail, relying on judgment and situational awareness. Ancient mariners offer a psychological and cultural precedent for this kind of exploration, one grounded in humility and cooperation rather than conquest. At a planetary level, humanity now shares a single canoe. Climate systems, oceans, and ecosystems connect us whether we acknowledge it or not. Ancient navigation was built on the understanding that everyone aboard shared fate. There were no individual successes in the middle of the sea. This perspective is increasingly relevant in a world where actions in one region affect lives everywhere. The story of ancient mariners ultimately challenges us to redefine success. Success is not reaching a destination at all costs. It is arriving without destroying the system that carried you there. Ancient navigators understood that survival depended on maintaining balance with the forces that enabled movement. This balance, once broken, could not be easily restored. As we near the end of this journey, one truth stands out. Ancient mariners did not conquer the oceans because they were fearless. They conquered them because they learned how to be afraid intelligently. Fear became a signal, not an obstacle. It sharpened awareness rather than paralyzing action. This transformation of fear into guidance may be one of humanity's greatest skills, and one we urgently need to relearn. The ocean remains, as it always has, a mirror. It reflects human strengths and weaknesses without judgment. Ancient mariners learned to read that reflection and adjust accordingly. The question now is whether modern humanity will do the same. In the next batch, we will bring this story to its final resolution, drawing together history, science, philosophy, and future vision into one clear answer to the question that began this journey. How did ancient mariners truly conquer the oceans, and what does that conquest ask of us today? As this journey approaches its end, the answer to how ancient mariners conquered the oceans finally comes into sharp focus. They did not conquer through force, speed, or domination. They conquered through comprehension. By learning the language of the sea and sky, they transformed uncertainty into information and distance into relationship. The ocean did not shrink, but human understanding expanded until it could move confidently within it. This distinction matters because it reframes conquest itself. Modern thinking often associates conquest with extraction, taking resources, claiming territory, imposing order. Ancient navigation reveals a different form of conquest, one that leaves the environment intact and the navigator changed. The ocean was not subdued, it was understood. This understanding allowed humans to cross it repeatedly, without destroying the systems that made those crossings possible. At the heart of this achievement was synthesis. Ancient mariners never relied on a single signal or method. They combined stars, swells, winds, clouds, birds, memory, and intuition into a unified awareness. Each element alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a resilient system. This holistic approach mirrors how complex systems actually function. Success emerges not from perfect control, but from balanced integration. This synthesis also extended across generations. No single navigator invented the system. Knowledge accumulated slowly, refined through success and failure, carried forward by culture rather than institutions. This long view allowed ancient mariners to adapt to gradual changes in climate, sea level, and ecosystem behavior. Modern societies often struggle with long-term thinking, prioritizing immediate outcomes over generational continuity. Ancient navigation demonstrates the power of patience at a civilizational scale. The story also reveals how deeply navigation shaped identity. Mariners did not see themselves as isolated individuals crossing an indifferent sea. They saw themselves as part of a lineage, guided by ancestors whose experiences still mattered. This sense of continuity anchored confidence. A navigator was never truly alone. They carried the memory of countless voyages within them. This psychological inheritance reduced fear and reinforced responsibility. Fear itself plays a crucial role here. Ancient mariners were not fearless. They were realistic. Fear was respected as information, not suppressed or denied. A sudden silence of birds, a confused swell pattern, an unexpected wind shift. These signs triggered caution rather than panic. Fear sharpened attention and encouraged adaptation. In modern contexts, fear is often treated as failure. Ancient navigation shows that intelligent fear can be a guide. Another essential element of this conquest was restraint. Ancient mariners knew when to turn back. They understood that success sometimes meant not completing a voyage. This willingness to retreat preserved lives and knowledge. Modern cultures often celebrate persistence without acknowledging the wisdom of withdrawal. Ancient navigation valued survival over pride. This ethic ensured continuity across centuries. The success of ancient navigation also challenges assumptions about technology. It reveals that tools are only as effective as the minds using them. Compasses and charts did not make Europeans superior navigators overnight. They were integrated into existing knowledge systems. Likewise, ancient mariners used the most advanced tools available to them: their senses, memory, and environment. The difference lies not in sophistication, but in compatibility. Their tools matched their world. This compatibility is precisely what modern humanity struggles with today. Technologies advance faster than cultural adaptation, or systems scale faster than ethical frameworks. Ancient navigation offers a cautionary tale and a solution. Progress must be integrated, not imposed. New tools must align with human perception and responsibility, rather than overwhelm them. The rediscovery of ancient navigation is therefore not just an academic correction. It is a reminder of alternative paths humanity has already walked. It shows that there are ways to engage with complexity that do not require domination, ways to explore without extraction, ways to move forward without severing connection. This realization reshapes how we view the past and the future simultaneously. The past is no longer a simple prelude to modernity, but a repository of solutions refined under conditions as challenging as any we face today. And the future is no longer a blank slate requiring entirely new thinking, but a continuation of a much older conversation between humans and their environment. Ancient mariners answered that conversation with attention. They listened, they observed, they adjusted, they taught, and they remembered. Their conquest of the oceans was not a single moment of triumph, but an ongoing practice, sustained over generations. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Mastery is not an event. It is a relationship maintained through care. As this story nears its conclusion, the opening question echoes again. How did ancient mariners cross vast uncharted waters with nothing but stars and waves? The answer is now clear. They were never navigating nothing. They were navigating one of the richest information environments on Earth, using a form of intelligence attuned to complexity rather than abstraction. The oceans were not empty. They were speaking. Ancient mariners learned how to listen. In the final batch, we will bring this journey to its closing horizon. We will return to the bold claim that began this story and confront it one last time, asking not whether ancient mariners were capable of scientific understanding, but whether modern humanity is capable of recognizing it, preserving it, and carrying it forward into the unknown seas ahead. As we approach the final horizon of this story, it is time to return to the bold claim that opened this journey, and to confront it honestly, without romanticism or exaggeration. Ancient mariners did not merely survive the oceans. They mastered them in ways that reveal a scientific understanding of the natural world that was deeply empirical, highly refined, and in some respects more holistic than many systems that followed. This is not an insult to modern science. It is an expansion of what science itself can be. Science is not defined by instruments or equations. It is defined by observation, testing, refinement, and transmission of reliable knowledge. By that definition, ancient navigation was science in its purest form. Hypotheses were tested not in laboratories, but in open water. Errors were punished immediately. Success was validated through repetition. Knowledge that failed was discarded. Knowledge that worked endured for centuries. This reframing matters because it exposes a blind spot in modern thinking. We often assume that scientific progress follows a single path, from superstition to reason, from intuition to measurement. Ancient navigation breaks that narrative. It shows that rigorous, repeatable, predictive knowledge can exist without writing, without formal mathematics, and without centralized institutions. The medium was different. The rigor was not. The mariners who crossed the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the North Atlantic were not guessing. They were operating within mental models of wind systems, celestial mechanics, wave dynamics, and ecological behavior. These models were not written down, but they were no less real. They were stored in memory, reinforced by culture, and tested by experience. This is why they worked. The tragedy is not that modern society invented better tools. The tragedy is that it assumed better tools made older knowledge irrelevant. In many cases, that assumption proved false. When traditional navigation declined, something irreplaceable was lost. A way of seeing the world that integrated humans into natural systems rather than separating them from them. Rediscovering this does not require rejecting modern technology. It requires humility. It requires acknowledging that progress is not a straight line, and that some forms of knowledge are not easily replaced once lost. It also requires recognizing that intelligence is culturally shaped. What looks like intuition from the outside is often expertise refined beyond conscious articulation. Ancient mariners also force us to reconsider what we mean by advancement. Is advancement the ability to move faster, extract more, and dominate environments? Or is it the ability to move wisely, sustainably, and with awareness of long-term consequences? By the second definition, ancient navigation represents a level of advancement that modern society is still struggling to achieve. The question then becomes not, how did they do it? That question has been answered. But why did we stop valuing it? The answer lies in power, convenience, and narrative. Written knowledge was easier to standardize. Instruments were easier to teach quickly. Empires favored systems that could be scaled rapidly, even if they were less resilient in the long run. Deep, embodied knowledge did not fit this model. And yet, when modern systems fail, when GPS signals drop, when climate patterns shift beyond prediction, when complex systems behave unpredictably, humanity is forced back toward the skills ancient mariners mastered: observation, adaptation, synthesis, and patience. These are not obsolete skills. They are foundational ones. The revival of traditional navigation is therefore not just an act of cultural preservation. It is an act of future-proofing. It restores ways of thinking that remain robust under uncertainty. It trains people to read the world directly, rather than only through abstraction. It rebuilds confidence in human perception at a time when many feel overwhelmed by complexity. This brings us back to the most unsettling implication of all. If ancient mariners truly possessed a scientific understanding of the oceans that modern society underestimated for centuries, then the limitation was never human capacity. It was human recognition. We failed to see intelligence because it did not look like our own. Correcting this failure is more than historical justice. It expands the range of solutions available to humanity. It invites us to learn from the past, not as a museum, but as a library. One filled with volumes written in waves, stars, winds, and memory. As this story draws toward its final words, one realization stands above all others. Ancient mariners did not conquer the oceans because they were exceptional anomalies. They conquered them because human beings, given time, attention, and respect for their environment, are capable of extraordinary understanding. The oceans did not change. Humans did. And they can, again. In the final batch, we will close this journey by bringing everything together, returning to the opening challenge, answering it completely, and leaving you with the one question that ancient mariners might ask us today as we stand at the edge of our own uncharted seas. Forget everything you thought you knew about ancient navigation. By now, that opening claim is no longer provocation, it is conclusion. Ancient mariners did not stumble across the world's oceans by accident, nor did they survive through luck or instinct alone. They crossed vast uncharted waters because they understood them. They read the ocean as a system, the sky as a structure, and life itself as information. What they achieved was not primitive. It was profound. The real revelation of this journey is not that ancient people could sail far. It is that they developed a way of knowing suited to complexity. Where modern systems often try to simplify the world into data points, you ancient navigators accepted complexity and trained themselves to live inside it. They did not demand certainty. They cultivated awareness. They did not separate themselves from the environment. They embedded themselves within it. This is why the opening question, how did they do it, turns out to be incomplete. The better question is, how we forgot that it was possible. Ancient mariners crossed oceans without maps, because the world itself was their map. Waves carried memory, stars carried direction, winds carried timing, birds carried news of land, culture carried knowledge across generations. None of this was vague, none of it was symbolic guesswork. It was tested, refined, and validated by survival itself. If the system failed, people died. If it worked, it endured. And it did endure, for thousands of years. The idea that such knowledge could exist without writing or instruments unsettles modern assumptions about intelligence. We are comfortable recognizing knowledge when it looks like equations, charts, and devices. We are less comfortable recognizing it when it lives in memory, movement, and relationship. Yet the oceans do not care how knowledge is stored. They respond only to whether it works. Ancient navigation worked. What makes this story matter now is not admiration for the past, but responsibility toward the future. Humanity once faced the largest unknown on Earth and learned to move through it without destroying it. Today, we face unknowns just as vast. Climate systems are shifting beyond historical patterns. Technologies evolve faster than social wisdom. Global decisions ripple instantly across the planet. Like the open ocean, these systems offer no fixed landmarks and no guaranteed routes. Ancient mariners would recognize this moment. They would recognize the danger of arrogance. They would warn against mistaking tools for understanding. They would remind us that no instrument can replace attention, and no model can replace relationship. They would insist that the first step toward safety is listening. Listening to the world, listening to experience, listening to those who carry memory. Perhaps the most important lesson ancient mariners offer is this: mastery does not mean control, it means alignment. The ocean was never controlled, it was cooperated with. That cooperation demanded humility, patience, and restraint, qualities modern systems often treat as inefficiencies. Yet without them, ancient navigation would have failed. Without them, modern systems now falter. The greatest loss was never the techniques themselves. It was the worldview that held them together. A worldview where humans were participants, not overseers. Where knowledge carried ethical weight. Where progress was measured in continuity rather than speed. Where success meant returning home without breaking the system that carried you. When traditional navigation was dismissed, humanity did not simply adopt better tools. It narrowed its imagination. It replaced listening with extraction, relationship with dominance, wisdom with convenience. Only now, as cracks appear in those assumptions, do we begin to recognize what was set aside. The revival of ancient navigation is not about turning backward. It is about widening the future. It reminds us that there are multiple ways to be intelligent, multiple ways to be scientific, and multiple ways to move through uncertainty. Some of those ways were refined under conditions harsher than anything most of us will ever face. Ancient mariners were not superheroes. They were human beings who trained deeply, remembered carefully, and acted responsibly. Their achievement tells us something both humbling and empowering. The limits we assume today are often cultural, not biological. Given time, care, and respect for complexity, humans can learn far more than we usually allow. So what does it truly mean that ancient mariners conquered the oceans? It means they conquered fear by replacing it with understanding. They conquered ignorance by cultivating attention. They conquered isolation by building connection. And they did so without conquering the ocean itself. That may be the most important distinction of all. As you step away from this story, you are left with the same challenge that faced those ancient navigators standing at the shoreline for the first time. The sea ahead is vast. The future is uncertain. The route is not written down. The question is not whether the journey is possible. The question is whether we will choose to navigate the way they did, with humility instead of arrogance, with awareness instead of domination, with wisdom instead of speed. The ocean is still speaking. The stars still rise. The waves still remember. The only question left is this: have we learned how to listen again?